In this class I want to talk about globalization. Now it's not a regular class in the sense we're going to develop particular theories or themes. This particular video is piecemeal. It's going to deal with several different topics, looking at different institutions and different ideas about globalization. They're all quite small areas, so it's a collection of ideas and short discussions of particular institutions. It's important that you stop the class from time to time, go across it again and make a note of the slide number. This time the slide number is in the top right hand side of the screen. You'll see at the moment it's slide 1 of 145. So 145 slides means it's also quite a big class. So it's not looking at any one theory or any particular issue. It's rather just a collection of bits and pieces about globalization, but important institutions that we should be aware of, and also some issues associated with globalization, which will be dealt with in summary form. So, having said all of that, we'll go through it and see what comes out. So we'll start by talking about what is globalization. Well, there are many definitions of globalization. It's the interdependence and interconnection of the modern world. I mean, it's a very general statement. That was in a white paper on international development in 1995 in the UK. It's the interdependence and interconnection of the modern world. The modern world is interconnected and it is interdependent, but to some extent so was the ancient world. There's always been contact between countries. Sometimes not good contact, sometimes it led to wars and invasions and so on, but there's always been contact of some sort. Perhaps it's a part of the human psyche to be interested in other countries and other peoples. But in the context of what we mean by globalization today, it's normally for commercial reasons. And I think that's the word that's missing in that particular statement. It's the interdependence and interconnection in the context of commerce of the modern world. It's also put forward by a writer, Lubers, as a process in which geographic distance becomes a factor of diminishing importance in the establishment and maintenance of cross-border economic, political and socio-cultural relations. Distance is becoming less important. The world is becoming interconnected. We now have trade with very distant countries, countries on the other side of the globe. And we deal with those countries in a very efficient and fast manner because of great improvements in telecommunications, in the internet, in general contact and general understandings between people for the purposes of trade. So we know more now about, let's say, China than we've probably ever done. And the Chinese people know more about us. One of the biggest tourist sections in the world today are the Chinese people who travel vast distances to see other cultures and other areas and pick up ideas and enjoy contact. So we have much more contact between peoples. And for that reason, distance does not seem to constitute the same issues and the same problems as was in the past. So all of this could lead to globalization. The idea that we have trade across international boundaries and the trade can flow more freely than perhaps ever before. It's also the circulation not only of goods and services but of ideas, information and people. As I said, we have greater amounts of tourism, people going to distant countries and people from those countries coming to us, and greater contacts between peoples. But we also have the flow of ideas. The internet is a great way of passing ideas. People are looking for new opportunities and the growth of entrepreneurship in different countries. So it's the circulation of not just goods and services, but of ideas and of information and of people. It's often said that the world has just simply got smaller. Got smaller in the sense that we have much more contact. We're much more familiar with other countries, and they are much more familiar with us. And we have much more contact, greater flow of ideas, tourism, entrepreneurship, commerce, trading, much more contact. Now, quotes from business and government about globalization. Well, according to Tony Blair, globalization is irreversible and irresistible. There's nothing, in a sense, we can do about it. This is the product of the technology we've got. We've got faster communications in terms of distribution, logistics. We've got better communications with the internet and with teleconferencing and with emails, and we have much more contact with tourism. It cuts all the way across all the areas in which we can have possible contact, and we've got that. And it's very difficult to move back from it. And governments throughout the world are starting to recognize this and build it into their approaches to dealing with each other. According to Bill Clinton, globalization is not a policy choice, it's a fact. It's not something that governments decide that they should engage in or not. It's simply there. It's happening. And it's happening almost without government approval or permission. It's happening anyway. And very few countries can stand aloof from it. In today's world, we could think of perhaps North Korea as a closed economy. But North Korea is supported by China and by some other countries, and it's in a sense artificially maintained. But countries that have not gone that route find globalization as inevitable. It's a fact. It happens, and in a sense they must participate if they're going to survive economically. There are different parts to globalization. We can see globalization on an economic level. It's mutually beneficial for countries to engage in this type of trade. It's a good idea for industry and commerce because markets are bigger and there are more opportunities. It's social because people are in contact with each other and we learn new ways, we learn new ideas, we learn new items of food, and we have more tourist destinations, and there's more social contact, more understanding between peoples. Technology, it all depends on technology to a large extent, on transportation systems, on good airlines and good shipping routes and reliable processes at the end ports to allow people and goods to enter easily one country to the next. But also we have technological improvements in the context of the internet and globalization caused through greater networks, electronic networks and telecommunication systems. There's greater ease of contact between suppliers in one country and the next, and between customers, and there's more information available as well about customer needs and requirements. So it's inevitable that there is a push towards globalization. And of course cultural. We're just learning how people live. We're learning about their beliefs, their political systems, their administrative systems, their schooling, their everything about them. And out of this there is a richer way of looking at the world. We learn from others and they learn from us. And we're able to share, in a sense, good practice. Their cultures remain intact. Generally speaking, they're able to preserve a lot of their old culture. But there is a modern culture as well. The modern culture being the online culture, the international culture. And with this there are modifications to traditional cultures which may be kept one side and preserved, but there's also modifications on the day-to-day culture in terms of language. There's greater use of, let's say, English throughout the world because English is the commercial language. There may be greater use of Spanish because it's a widely spoken language, or of Mandarin. So other languages are seen as important, and to survive in the modern world, a lot of people opt to have second languages because the world is interconnected. Now, let's look at what drives globalization. Well, an increase in information. We know more about other countries, we know more about their markets, the size of the markets, the types of products they require, the way they live. There's more information available. There's more information about how to trade with the country and the requirements for trade with that country. There's better communications, as I said earlier, the internet and telecommunication systems and so on. There's also more travel between the countries and more communication through travel, because travel has become easier. And the ease of travel has led to not just ideas flowing from one country to the other, but the other way around. There's widespread understanding of culture and issues and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And this greater understanding enables globalization to take place. So there's an increase of knowledge, of sharing ideas, sharing ideas about customer relations management and about the type of products that are successful in one country may be successful in another country, and what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. And so there's greater sharing of knowledge. We know more about other countries now than we've probably ever done. And there's also an opening of markets, free trade agreements, and the World Trade Organization trying to liberalize trade, trying to take down the barriers to trade. So it's easy for countries to trade with each other and for companies to set up subsidiaries in other countries or to have all sorts of trading relationships with the other countries. There's greater freedom, economic freedom and contact between countries. There's a reduction in tariffs on imports and obstacles to imports. In the past, perhaps imports from a particular country may be blocked or may encounter heavy tariffs. A tariff is just a tax on an import, because countries were trying to stop cheap imports from other countries. Now, the reduction in tariffs and the liberalization of trade means there's more opportunities for countries to trade, uninhibited, unrestricted almost, between each other. There's also an attraction of foreign investment. Companies in a high-cost country may see opportunities to open production plants in countries where labour is cheaper and the cost of setting up is cheaper, or there's less bureaucratic regulation, and so there may be a spreading of industrialization throughout the world caused by globalization. It may be that countries will start to develop production capacity, perhaps countries that in the past were mainly agrarian, mainly based on agriculture. And we've seen this with China. Many parts of China in the past were poor and they were mostly based on agriculture. Now they are large industrial centres, with large commercial premises and bases and centres as well. So the spread of ideas and the spread of the economic base of the world has gone with globalization. Globalization has encouraged companies to set up in other countries and to trade with other countries, and ideas have flown across, and indigenous entrepreneurs have latched on to popular ideas in other countries and set up similar businesses in their country. And so, generally speaking, ideas have moved very fast across the world. It's difficult to talk about the history of globalization. We think about it as something that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years, or maybe even less. But in fact, globalization has been around for a long time. We can think of ancient trade. Now, I know ancient trade and globalization are different things, but this would be the basis of it. For example, 2000 BC, ancient Greeks traded around the Mediterranean. So ancient Greek culture was spread out around the Mediterranean. But there was a lot of contact throughout the Middle East at that time between different cultures that were trading with each other. The Silk Route, for example, throughout Asia. If we look at the Silk Route, it's a highly complex route, and some of it quite dangerous. Some of it was based on seas, and bearing in mind the shipping technology of the time was not very safe or very sophisticated, as indeed navigation was very hit and miss. Nonetheless, something inside people drove them to try to seek out new routes, new trade, and people moved in a quite sophisticated manner right throughout that region. And it's a vast region. It covers a lot of the globe. We have to recognize that the trade and globalization are different. Trade is taking products from one part to another, but globalization involves much more. It's a more integrated process. It involves greater levels of contact. Globalization truly requires modern technology, communications technology, and facilities to move people and products fast between countries. Ancient trade was just that, it was trade. But it does show that ancient peoples wanted to have contact and wanted to explore opportunities. So entrepreneurship has been around for a long time. Globalization is a movement towards a borderless world. It involves the increasing exchange of goods, capital and people due to increased economic integration. The globalization process is promoted by trade liberalization on the part of national governments and efficient communication networks. So we can see that globalization really requires good communications networks, and it requires a willingness on the part of individual governments to join in. But as I said earlier, to some extent that's becoming less of an option. It's difficult for countries now to exclude this process, simply because it is overwhelming. It has swept across the world. There is much greater contact between people, between communication between people, greater understandings between people, recognizing of course some countries have differences, and there may be differences due to religion or politics or history or whatever, but there is greater contact between people, and there is greater contact economically now than it's ever been. International trade involves buying and selling across national boundaries without integration. If we go back to the map we had earlier, it was trading across national boundaries. It was moving spices from one part of the world to a different part of the world, going through different countries and trying to get safe passage from one country to the next. But it wasn't attempting to integrate those countries or integrate the economic systems of the countries. It was simply moving goods from one part to the next. So there is a difference between globalization, which is much more embracive. It involves communication systems, it involves much more liberalization, whereas trade is movement of goods without the attempt to integrate anything else. The first multinational companies, well, surprisingly enough, these go back a long way. One of the most popular is referred to as the Dutch East India Company back in the 1600s. This had its own private army. It was a company, but it had a private army which protected its interests wherever it went. It owned substantial territory, and it had a monopoly on the spice trade in Europe. So it was a very big and important company in Europe. It had its own stock. It was the first company to issue stock. So it had shareholders. And that was a novelty in itself, that the ownership of the company could be spread out in this way. In fact, it had its own flag. So a very important company. It was really one of the first multinational companies. It operated in many countries right throughout the world. It had a presence. It had its own fleet of ships. It has, as I said, its own army. It had its own protection from pirates and so on. It was a very sophisticated organization. So this idea of a multinational corporation is, again, not the product of the 20th century. It goes way back. Really, the whole process of the industrial revolution, that kicked off what we've got today. It had to start somewhere. The idea of globalization now is trading goods and services across national boundaries. Well, goods and services had to start. So if we wanted to go back to where it began, we know that trade operated in the ancient world. We've talked about that. But the modern world, you could really say, started in the UK with the Industrial Revolution. Started in Shropshire in the UK when they started to make iron, and it started with the industrial processes. And there was something in the UK at the time that many great scientific thinkers seemed to come up in a very short space of time with very new and revolutionary ideas about industry. And it was a movement of people off agriculture and into industry. But of course the conditions of employment at the time were horrific, were dangerous, there were long hours, the people were not paid very much, it was subsistence. But nonetheless, this is what kicked off, in a sense, the modern world. Other countries joined in. Germany and many other countries joined in and made significant contributions. And from now we've got genuinely a global economy where scientific discoveries and ideas pass freely almost, subject to protection of intellectual property, but they pass quite easily from one country to the next. Well, with the Industrial Revolution, it started really with recognition of the power of coal and the use of steam to drive engines. Engines were used in industry as a source of power. Engines could run machines, and the machines could make products. The machines were tended to by people, but the machines were much more powerful than people could ever use. So there was much more production was capable because of this new technology. And of course the new technology was also used in increased use of electric motors. You'd have perhaps steam power driving electric generators, and there was the introduction of electricity. There was the introduction of all sorts of electronic, or not in a modern sense, but electronic equipment within industry, electric equipment perhaps is a better way of putting it, in industry. More facilities and more understanding of electricity itself. I mean, Faraday and Watt And people like this, who presented papers at the Royal Institution in London, were heroes of the time. These were the people who were leading this whole new process, this new way of living, which was happening in the UK. Railways were expanded. And before the railways, there was a drive to make canals, to try and make better communication systems. Canals, a lot was invested in building canals in the UK, but the canals were quickly superseded by railways. And there were great pioneers of railways. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, George Stephenson, many great thinkers and many great innovators in railways that again changed the whole pattern of communications throughout the country. And railway technology became established as a part of the communication systems within the country, and products could move from one place to another and move much more cheaply. People could move from one place to another. So the whole country was changing. This was the Industrial Revolution. And if we look at this in the context of globalization, now we have efficient air travel. But everything had to start somewhere. And it started really with the modern world, could be argued to start with the Industrial Revolution. There was the expansion of world trade. People started to deal with each other right throughout the 1800s. Countries were dealing with each other, and there was a spread of empires. The British Empire, for example, the French. Many countries had interest in other countries, and sometimes the influence was bad and sometimes the influence was good. But with that came the spread of ideas and the spread of technologies. It was all halted by the First World War. The First World War was a disaster in history, not just because of the savagery of the war, but also because it halted all of the contacts, and it altered all the relationships that had been built up in the years leading up to the First World War. At the end of the First World War, the different economies and different countries that were involved were in the process of rebuilding, trying to recover from what had happened. Of course, in the interwar period, there was a lot of unemployment, a lot of deprivation and poverty, and a lot of people looking for better ways to live. And then the Second World War happened. And at the end of the Second World War, there was certainly a big desire to expand trade, to have economic growth and greater prosperity, and to try to also ensure that these World War events could not happen again, or try to prevent world wars in the future. So there was a big expansion of international trade at the end of the Second World War. And also the development of transnational companies. Companies started to go global. Coca-Cola from America was starting to make inroads into soft drinks markets in many countries, and there was greater advertising and marketing of products from one country into another, and greater contacts between countries. It was facilitated by radio and later by television. Telephone systems had improved immensely, so there was greater contact, and it was starting to emerge. There was no internet. That didn't come for a long time. So eventually those were the bases of what had happened that led up to eventually better electronic systems, more breakthroughs in science, better educational facilities throughout the world, better health facilities, more travel between peoples. The foundations for globalization were set in place. And really, these go back to the 1970s, 1960s. There was much more contact. Politicians started to talk to each other. There was less aggression, greater understanding. There was the formation of economic blocs. The Europeans started to come together. America was very powerful in that period, and America gave a lead to the world in many areas. If we look at the growth of the USA, throughout the 20th century it was the richest economy. It's only recently been passed by China, but of course China has a lot more people than America. But throughout the 20th century, in absolute terms, America was the richest country in the world. It was the birth of consumerism. It was the place where industry and commerce tuned up to the needs of the customer. The customer was taken into account in advertising, in marketing. The customer was seen as important in terms of the growth and prosperity of particular companies and industries. There was greater emphasis on, as I said, the needs of the customer, and all of this was popularized throughout the world. Other countries were engaged in reconstruction as well. Japan, for example, throughout the 60s was gearing up with perhaps a different emphasis, an emphasis on quality, whereas in the West and in America it was more an emphasis on quantity, making mass production, making many items and selling them. In Japan they were trying to emphasize quality. In 1913, Henry Ford used production line manufacturing in the US, and this was safer and better results, more productivity. It was the division of labour. The production line was introduced and workers did a small task. They became adept at performing that task and hence more efficient, so output grew. You could also say it was very dehumanizing. People were doing a very small task and were limited to doing that small task. But that was the birth of mass production, and it was popularized by Henry Ford. Nowadays, mass production is still used. Sometimes we don't see it. It may be used in many countries in the context of textiles or assembly plants or whatever. It's still there. It hasn't gone away. America became a superpower after the Second World War. It had a large military capability, and it had very sophisticated weaponry. It was challenged by the Soviet Union, as it was then, which was a combination of several countries, mostly dominated by Russia. And it was also developing sophisticated weaponry systems. And this was the period known as the Cold War. So it divided the world. There was a pro-communist camp and an anti-communist camp, generally speaking. And that inhibited trade with certain countries. But America became a very large and a very powerful country after the Second World War. And it provided a lot of economic aid to Europe. Europe had been destroyed by the Second World War. Countries had been destroyed. Germany had been completely destroyed, just about. The UK had been destroyed, large parts of it. And America put a lot of resources into Europe in a plan called the Marshall Aid Program. Marshall Aid was simply putting billions of dollars into Europe to rebuild Europe. So Europe was broadly rebuilt by the Americans at the end of the Second World War. It also provided aid to many other countries throughout the world. So it had a very vigorous program of passing out aid to other countries. Some people would say the aid was tied to countries behaving in certain ways or having vigorous anti-communist programs or whatever. But the fact was, America was propping up a lot of countries in terms of aid and development in that period. There's also the development of air travel. Contact between countries was greatly facilitated by air travel. If it wasn't for air travel, it would take a long time for people to visit different countries and distant countries. So a reliable source of travel, air travel, was important. And this developed at the end of the Second World War and is constantly under review and developing today. The development of communications, ease of communications internationally, has been promoted right throughout the period. Now we have the internet and almost instantaneous contact with just about any country in the globe. We can video conference with people in remote parts. We can send emails and have almost instantaneous responses. We can consult websites and blogs and disseminate information very easily because of modern communications techniques. The idea of liberalizing trade was caught up with an initiative by a British economist, John Maynard Keynes, who published a famous work in 1936, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And in the book and in his writings, also publicised in the Times newspaper, the Times of London newspaper, throughout the Second World War, he advocated fixed exchange rates. He advocated the liberalisation of trade, and one of the obstacles to trade he saw was exchange rates and volatility in exchange rates. So he argued exchange rates should be fixed. And this culminated in a meeting in 1944 at a small New Hampshire place called Bretton Woods. And this became known as the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, in which countries tried to liberalise trade, tried to get rid of one of the obstacles to trade, which was the uncertainty caused by exchange rate fluctuations. So it was a UN conference in 1944, and it was conducted in America, as I said, in Bretton Woods. Don't forget, in 1944, the Second World War was still continuing. I suppose such is the confidence on the part of the Allies that they were going to win the war that they had the conference in Bretton Woods to plan the post-Second World War world. 45 governments committed to the Bretton Woods negotiations and ultimately to the treaty. And before talking about the International Monetary Fund, I should say the Bretton Woods Agreement was to fix exchange rates one against the other so that trade would flourish, and that would be a way of getting economic growth into the world economy and making the world a more prosperous place. Bretton Woods Agreement lasted until the 1970s. Difficult to say when exactly it broke down, but somewhere in the early 70s, mid 70s, when countries could no longer hold fixed exchange rates, could no longer hold their currency fixed against another country, so currencies were allowed to fluctuate, introducing uncertainty. But by that time it was felt on the part of governments that industry and commerce was robust and was capable of dealing with the uncertainty, and it would not be too detrimental to allow the currencies to fluctuate. But the point in terms of this particular talk is that Bretton Woods was another initiative towards globalization. It was a way of trying to promote trade, which would ultimately lead on to globalization as we call it. There was also the International Monetary Fund, which has been on the screen now for a few minutes. There was also the development of the IMF. It was created to ensure the stability of the international monetary and financial system. It was like the World Banker, not the World Bank, but it was like the World Banker. It was a way of monitoring individual governments and their capability of meeting their debts, and it was a fund that was designed to help out countries who were in financial distress. but also to make recommendations for how to solve the issues and how to get the countries back onto a firm footing. In this case, there was about 185 countries who paid into the fund. I'm not sure what the current figure is. It would be worth checking it online. But many countries contribute towards the fund and pay into the fund. The money was used to prevent crisis. Whenever a crisis was arising, a country was on the point of bankruptcy or couldn't pay its debts, or there was a big issue about the survival of a particular country, an economic survival of a particular country, the IMF could step in and help out the country, but also change the policies of the country. Sometimes countries pursued erroneous or bad policies that needed to be changed. It could also pursue growth policies, try to help countries to grow and to enable countries to follow policies which would promote economic growth. And also to alleviate poverty. It's difficult to specify what can be done about poverty. It's at a magnitude that is very difficult to conceive. It applies to so many countries, and it was an effort on the part of the IMF to try and help particularly poor countries, to try and develop industry and production, to try and help its own populations. It was not necessarily an agency for granting aid to help humanitarian efforts. It was rather trying to help long-run strategies within countries to try and get the countries to produce and to build up their own production base, and in that way promote an alleviation of poverty. There were other institutions, the World Bank, established at Bretton Woods as well. This made post-war loans help to, say, rebuild Europe. So it made loans to Europe to try and help Europe to put back its infrastructure and get back its productive capacity. As I said, Europe had been mostly destroyed by the Second World War. It set up to fund projects which further economic development of member nations. It tried to help countries who subscribed to it. It tried to help them to build up their economic development, build up their industries and their infrastructure, and published reports that would help them in guiding their policies and trying to facilitate a whole growth culture, an international growth culture between its member organisations and member countries. The 2000 aim of the World Bank was to free the world of poverty. From an economic perspective, that's very difficult to see. It's the case that world population is growing very fast, and the means of subsistence, the means of providing food and shelter and medical care and education and so on for an increasing world population is very difficult. And leaving it to one agency, the World Bank, to try and solve that does seem very idealistic. But that was the aim that the World Bank set itself in 2000, at the turn of the millennium. It was funded by member nations. The objective, I think, still stays in place, but as I said, it's very difficult. A famous writer in England in the 1700s, Thomas Malthus, talked about the problem of population and the means of subsistence. Population tends to change geometrically. In other words, if two people have a child, then the population has gone up by 50%. It's gone from 2 to 3. 2 people have had a child. Well, the means of subsistence, the output from industry and commerce, it's unlikely to go up by 50% in a year. So therefore, population requirements outstrip production, and that is, according to Malthus, the root cause of poverty. And this is one of the reasons why we have world poverty. Now, the World Bank, by the way, that's the email address for the World Bank. It's a vital source of financial and technical assistance to developing countries. It does disseminate ideas and technical know-how to countries, and it does make some financial contribution as well. It tries to engage in development and has two organizations that are involved in this. It's owned by 186 members, but as I said, it's worth checking online to see if that number is the precise current number. It may change over time. But it has two main institutions. So we have the World Bank and we have the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IRBD. But we also have the International Development Association, the IDA. Now, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, well, it's normally aimed at middle-income countries, countries that are not developed and are not underdeveloped. They're in the process of growth, they're growing, but they need assistance, they need additional help to enable them to capitalize on ideas and changes in the modern world and introduce new technologies and new know-hows and also improve their infrastructure. It deals with credit-worthy companies in poor countries. Simply because a company is in a poor country doesn't mean it's going to get assistance. It could be a badly managed company or a poorly thought out one. But good companies, credit-worthy companies in poor countries, may apply for assistance and would be considered seriously. The International Development Association makes loans to the poorest countries. Now this one deals with the absolute poorest countries, tries to help them, tries to get some sort of industry going, small-scale industry perhaps, or developing initiatives in education or in infrastructure, in transport, tries to help the country to try and get off the ground, try to get it started in the development process. Now we also have the World Trade Organization, WTO. This was formed in 1995. The goal is to ensure the free flow of trade throughout the world. It tries to get rid of tariff barriers and obstacles to trade. It's a guard against the negative social and economic effects of protectionism. It's constantly monitoring restrictions to trade and indirect barriers to trade, sometimes bureaucratic barriers that countries may lay against importation, documentation, for example, and port clearance bureaucracies. So the World Trade Organization keeps an eye on the patterns of trade to try and improve the liberalization of trade throughout the world. There are also different ways in which people, countries and governments I should say, talk to each other to try and find different ways of trading and to liberalize trade and to promote economic development and further contacts, trade contracts. For example, the G8. The G8 is the group of 8 countries. In 1995, 6 nations agreed to meet and have a forum to discuss economic issues. Just meet to talk about how they could help each other and how they could improve contacts between their countries and economic contact. This was the USA, the UK, Japan, France, Italy, Germany. In 1976, Canada joined, and it became the G7. So the G6 went to G7. In 1997, Russia joined the G8. But Russia was suspended in 2014 because of its annexation of the Crimea, which was previously controlled by the Ukraine. So there was the dispute with Russia. It's still suspended in 1995. Its future within that organisation is still in the balance. There's a rolling presidency. The country who holds the presidency sets the issues. So they take turns to host it, and the country that hosts it can set the agenda for the discussion as to what's important, perhaps something related to world trade, to economic development. It could be related to security and world trade, or protection of intellectual property, or increasingly issues about internet hacking and stealing commercially sensitive data. So it's a forum in which countries meet to discuss issues. There's also the EU, the European Union. This was created to promote economic and social progression of member states. It's a trading bloc, spelled BLOC. It's a trading bloc. It's meant to facilitate trade. But now we think of the European Union as having gone much further than just simply facilitating trade. It now has its own currency. It has freedom of movement of people and of capital. It's becoming like the United States. It's becoming like one country with separate states. The only difference between the European Union and the United States to some extent is the fact that the countries have different cultures, different languages, different traditions, but it attempts to almost mimic the United States. The idea is to have a single state in the end, one with perhaps an overarching government, and the various member states would be subsidiary to that and would follow the laws of the European Union. It's quite a controversial one, and the UK has always had an issue or problems about the direction in which the European Union is moving. So we have to see to what extent the UK agrees with this policy of closer integration and coordination between member states. It may be that the UK negotiates separate arrangements with the European Union. The idea is to establish a single market. As I said, free movement of people, free movement of capital, free movement of ideas, more coordination right across the European Union. It allows free movement of people, goods, services, capital within its boundaries. And it allows the countries to exert more influence globally than they would on their own. So it's argued that smaller countries, for example, can make their voice heard through the European Union on a global stage. Alternatively, you could argue that every country has become smaller because now it's only one of a member of the European Union. The European Union has approximately 27 members, and therefore each country is only 1/27th. And in fact, it's not that, because some countries in Europe are clearly more important than others. Germany seems to dominate Europe. Then there's France, the UK. The bigger countries have more influence, clearly. So as to whether the smaller countries have a global voice by virtue of membership of the European Union is debatable. Now, trade. Well, global trade. Countries have trade controlled by rules made by the World Trade Organization. All members have equal say. So countries join the World Trade Organization. They have equal say. They may negotiate and debate and move for particular measures. And they can object to certain ideas or certain proposals. The UN estimates that poor countries lose large amounts every year due to unfair trade rules. So the onus is on the richer countries to ensure that the poorer countries are not disadvantaged by virtue of their poverty, and that the producers within the poorer countries have got more say and more opportunities, perhaps, to deal in the bigger markets. Rules enforced by trade embargoes on countries who don't comply. So if a country does not comply to the World Trade Organization rules, then that country could be blacklisted amongst the other countries, and they will cease to trade with that country, which could be a disaster for a country. So it's a very powerful weapon. It does lead to agreement, like it or not. So the members of the World Trade Organization tend to fall in line because they don't wish to suffer the wrath or the displeasure of the other countries. It doesn't apply to transnationals. Transnational companies operate in different countries. Perhaps it started in one country, but now it operates mainly in other countries. These companies are difficult to control. They're difficult to regulate. They operate in so many different parts of the world. So by and large, the World Trade Organization find it difficult, as do national governments find it difficult to control these companies. The free trade agreements, well, there's the North American Free Trade Agreement. We've talked about the European Union as one type of free trade area. Well, there's the North American one, set up in 1994. No tariffs on imported goods between Mexico, the US and Canada. So the three big countries in North America, Canada, America and Mexico, going from north to south, those three allow goods to freely move across their borders. It's not always good for the poor. For example, US maize is cheaper to produce and sold in Mexico at a lower price than the Mexican maize. So sometimes the richer country is cheaper than the poorer country at producing products, and therefore poor countries' industries may be adversely affected by free trade. Generally speaking, we think of free trade as good for the poorer countries. It enables the poorer countries to get access to bigger markets and so on. But sometimes the bigger country is still the cheaper producer. So free trade could be detrimental to the poorer country, as in the example we've got here. There are other examples of free trade areas. NAFTA, as I just said, that's the North American one, America, Mexico and Canada. But there's also ASEAN. There are several of these. ASEAN is Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand and Vietnam. And those countries are rapidly coming together, and there are even proposals to develop institutions similar to the European Union. It's now easier to travel, for example, between those countries. Once they start to lock their currencies closer and closer together, then there may be opportunities even for single currencies in the future. So it's starting to move similar to the European Union, and we can see blocks emerging. The North American bloc, BLOC, the European Union bloc and the ASEAN bloc. So countries will start to combine in this way, perhaps. There are also institutions to try to bring about fairness in world trade, and I think we should mention there's organisations to promote fair trading relationships between countries. Fair trade is one of these. It helps producers in poor countries to receive a fair reward for their efforts. That's the address, the online address for fair trade. It simply promotes small-scale production, and it looks after the poor interest, the poorer countries' interests in bigger markets. Tries to make customers in the more prosperous parts of the world aware of the significance of the price, and perhaps customers in richer countries still look for bargains and still look for the cheapest price, and that's rational economic behaviour. But looking for the cheapest price can be a disaster for the very poor in poor countries who have exported that product. So sometimes a fair price, we're not too sure what's meant by a fair price, but perhaps a higher price would be more equitable and would give the producers a greater return. It often happens in the context of coffee and primary products and foodstuffs and areas like this, where the products are shipped to richer countries and sold at very cheap prices, which means the producers in those countries get a small return, and of course therefore the people who work for the producers in those countries get very poor salaries and wages. And what fair trade tries to do is make consumers in richer countries aware of this. Now, the effects of globalization. Well, there's a cultural effect. We know that there's more contact between countries, and we're more aware of the cultural traditions of other countries. You could say there's a loss of cultural identity because of the internet. It seems to have some sort of singularity about its presence, and people in different countries will be concerned about the speed of their internet, and they will talk about megabytes and gigabytes and different browsers and operating systems and so on. There is a sort of a levelling out of culture to some extent as well, and that could lead to the loss of cultural identity. The images from one country may overwhelm other countries and set the fashions and the trends in other countries. It could be a loss of language. English is the biggest commercial language in the world. English is a very flexible language. It can incorporate new words and new ideas very rapidly and quite easily. And as a consequence, it's used a lot in the context of the internet. And therefore, there could be a loss of language in some countries. We're more familiar with lifestyles in other countries, with food and with traditions, and that's probably a good thing. When there's more opportunities for tourism and for promoting attractive parts of other countries and trying to gain tourist trade because of those facilities, and popularizing those facilities as well. So there is a world culture emerging. Marshall McLuhan, a great sociologist, once talked about the global village. And maybe that's what we're experiencing, a movement towards a global village, where we have similar concepts right throughout the world because of the impact of the technology. We talk about Facebook, we talk about Twitter, we tweet people. So the language is becoming uniform. There's also language itself. English, as I said, is dominant in terms of engineering and world trade. It's a very flexible language. It's a very powerful language. It's a technical language. It's estimated around 35% of the world's mail and telexes and cables and so on are all in English. It's also estimated by some, and you can look these figures up on the internet, but 40% of the world's radio programs are in English, and the internet is mostly in English. The figures I quote there are just ones I pulled out of various websites over a period of time. You may want to update this, but certainly it's the case that English is a very powerful language in terms of world communications, telecommunications, and that is one of the impacts of globalization. There's also a legal or an ethical issue related to cross-border trade and how to look at cross-border trade and what items are traded. There may be trade in illegal items, ivory, for example. There's ethical considerations about trade. There are illegal items of trade, narcotics, for example. But there's also greater understanding between peoples, and issues associated with human rights and the abuse of human rights can be more clearly identified because of the impact of globalization on contacts between peoples. People know how others are dealt with in other countries and what the legal systems are and how people are treated. So there's much more understanding between countries about life in other countries. Travel was easy to travel, easier to get visas now than probably ever before. And there's a bigger impact because of tourism as a consequence. Even societies which in the past were closed, for example the Chinese society was broadly closed in the past, but now it constitutes a very large proportion of world tourism. There's also the loss of boundaries in the sense that if we look at the European Union, it's easy to move from one part of the European Union, vast differences across many boundaries without any restrictions or paper requirements. There's more immigration and migration due to easy transportation. People can move from one part of the world to another quite easily and back. So transportation systems have improved. And it's easy to trade goods across boundaries as well because shipping lanes are better established. There's more security in shipping, although piracy is still an issue. It remains in certain parts of the world. But by and large, there's better contact, better shipping arrangements, better port facilities, better throughput at the ports, and better logistical systems for the transportation of goods. And people can travel because of better airlines and better rail systems and so on. So all in all, travel has become easier. That's the point. The environment, well, there are global climate issues. We have set about the destruction of the planet through rapid industrialization, but that was broadly out of ignorance. We didn't understand the connection between what we were doing and the effects that it was having on the climate. There are greater movements now because of agreements between countries to try and reduce the carbon footprint. The Kyoto Agreement, for example, to try to reduce the carbon emissions. And countries that don't adhere to it suffer a bad name because they are destroying the climate, the one that we all need. We need clean air. We don't want higher sea levels, and we don't want the destruction of the climate. This is the only planet we've got. There is increased pollution due to the abuse of the system because of rapid industrialization and the unfettered development of industrialization. But as I said, mostly due to ignorance in the past. We didn't know what the connection was. We didn't take it into account. We assumed almost that it was limitless. The planet had an infinite capacity to take what we throw at it. We now know that this is different. There's increased pressure on countries to use natural resources. For example, Brazil is clearing out the Amazon rainforest. It's knocking it down at a phenomenal rate. And we need the Amazon rainforest for our oxygen. It's what we breathe. So we need agreements on the use of timber. We need agreements on the preservation of important resources, planetary resources, like the Amazon rainforest. And to get that, we need politicians to talk and some means of compensating the Brazilians for not knocking it down, for not destroying that natural resource. Because as a people of the planet, we all need it. Industrial effects. Well, the emergence of worldwide production markets. Companies have moved to different countries, and production can take place in one country and be shipped to another country for completion. Semi-processed goods, components can be moved from one country to another. Final assembly can be in another country. It's a globalized production system. And it's multi-country. Most countries who are involved in this globalized process will have companies within their boundaries and jurisdictions that do not make products complete. They make part products which are then shipped to other countries for completion. They'll have companies within their jurisdictions that perhaps make products and then ship them elsewhere for packaging and distribution. So trade has become truly globalized. The technology, as we said often right throughout this talk, has changed the face of the planet. We have the internet and social networking, Facebook, Twitter, all of the various social network sites, which really bring people from different cultures, different societies together, and they talk and share experiences and get greater understanding of each other. There's information sharing, online forums and databases, global communications. The web can have web conferencing, and there's Skype, and Google has web facilities and teleconferencing facilities as well, and these are free facilities. So in the past it was expensive just to make a phone call from one country to another. Now it's possible to have instantaneous contact, almost free. Pay a fixed cost for the internet, or perhaps some small running cost, and make very expensive contact with other countries, distant countries perhaps. And the data is easily picked up from databases, and it's published online, and there are forums, and companies can pick up insights into markets and market requirements in other countries and develop products to match those requirements. It's a global market, and the economic impact of that is immense. Global markets means very large markets. That means economies of scale and larger organizations, larger companies producing on a larger scale. It means companies perhaps breaking into different sections to meet different segments of the market. There's a free exchange of goods and capital, easy movement of goods and capital between different countries. Countries are interdependent on one another, so a problem in one country may affect many. So there is an interdependence, and as such there should be mutual support from one country to the next. There's increased competition in the form of global markets, leading to an increase in skills and innovation in order to compete. So more skills are required, greater emphasis on innovation and technical change, and this fuels competition. The companies that are more innovative and have the better skills and the better workforces, the better trained, these are the ones who are better equipped to survive and capture the market until the others can catch up. Financial. Well, it's a worldwide financial market. We see on the financial press now that it reports stock exchanges in Shanghai, in America, in the UK, in France, in Germany. It's globalized, and one market can affect the others. There's also the growth of overseas investment. Countries can see opportunities in other countries, possibilities for investment. They can see companies in other countries and can buy shares in those. So the financial world is interwoven, it's interconnected. And social. Increased access to internet in remote areas. It's not just confined to big countries. The small, poorer countries have access as well, and they know what's happening in the bigger countries. They know from their contacts and from what they can see online and what they can see on television, and they know what's required. So in a sense, they know the road they need to travel, and they know what's required of them. They may not have the resources to do so, and they may need support in doing so. And that's where institutions like the World Bank and the IDA and so on will affect the development in those countries. But they can see through contact and through even small-scale contact between people on social networking sites in contact with people in other countries in social networking sites. They can see what is required, what products are required, what the lifestyle is, and that may challenge them to get something moving along the same lines. It gives them a pathway. It tells them the direction in which to travel if they want the same lifestyle. They may not want it, but if they do. The negative effects of globalization. Well, the rich-poor divide is growing. Rich countries are getting richer, poor countries tend to be getting poorer. Despite the effects that the IDA and the World Bank has and the International Monetary Fund has, some countries stay poor. There are all sorts of issues that we could offer as explanations for this. Climate, for example, perhaps changing climate, or just climate itself. It could be very hot countries or very cold countries. It could be civil strife, wars. It could be a breakdown of law and order and the emergence of gangs and insecurity caused by the breakdown of law and order. It could just be simply a poverty in terms of education and the lack of resources. There are all sorts of ways of understanding why it is that the poor countries have not developed more than they should have, or they could have. Why is it that some parts of the world have developed immensely and other parts have not? Why precisely is that the case? And of course, to engage in that sort of discussion would need a very detailed set of circumstances, practical circumstances related to each, to try and do some sort of comparison and try to work out why is it that some countries have developed. Some countries were destroyed, say by the Second World War. Germany was destroyed. Now Germany is the strongest country in Europe. In 1945 there was nothing. By the year 2000 it led Europe. How could that happen? And why is it that some countries were poor and have even got poorer in the same time scale? So that is the subject of a very difficult piece of analysis that needs to be conducted elsewhere. We can't get into that one here. Some estimates say that billions of people survive on very little every day. That's the extent of the poverty. Why that poverty exists is difficult to explain. It may be too easy to say, well, Malthus, as I said earlier, said that there's simply too many people on the planet and too few resources. That might be too simple an explanation. It may be related to all sorts of other issues, a paucity of resources, a lack of resources in some countries. It could be down to corruption, it could be down to mismanagement, it could be down to a lack of education and health, poor infrastructure, lack of industry. It could be the cultures against industry. All sorts of issues that need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. The exploitation of resources encouraged in poor countries who need materials to trade. Some countries, some poor countries, have to sell their scarce resources at a very cheap rate because they need to survive. They are desperate for foreign exchange. And therefore they have to sell their limited resources cheaply. This could be mineral deposits. It could be sources of tin or of certain metallic elements that are needed, say, for batteries or needed for particular products. And the countries have to sell these cheaply because they need the foreign exchange, and the buyers know the countries need foreign exchange, so they offer less. And that could be one of the negative effects of globalization. Countries want foreign investment. They will sacrifice environmental and human policies to get it. Poor wages and less safety. We know, for example, many countries have sweatshops and people working long hours for very little. And maybe that's because people in the West want cheap products. They want to pay very little for clothing. But the clothing has to be made in other countries where people receive very little. Now, how that's reconciled is difficult to say. We know that companies set up in other countries, sometimes simply to save on imports and export regulations and shipping, and it's cheaper to set up and produce in those countries. But sometimes they set up because labour is cheaper, because they can afford to pay the workers less. They pay the workers less, they generate more profits as a consequence. And they're able to do it without bringing down the wrath of pressure groups and interested organisations. Now you could say it's wrong, it probably is wrong, but you could say it's wrong, but that case needs to be argued. Is it better that the people have some jobs rather than no jobs? Or what's the tipping point? These are very difficult points, and they need a lot of consideration and a lot of research before we could engage in proper discussion of these issues. What we're doing in this session is just highlighting them, just mentioning them and passing on. The barriers to globalization, well, the rich guard traditional industries. In Europe, agriculture has been protected through the common agricultural policy. So rich countries tend to guard particular industries. Sometimes they see particular industries as strategic. They can't afford to let other countries produce those items just in case a dispute arises and they cut back the supplies, then there is a problem. So Europe protects agriculture. Protect country farms by imposing high imports on products from abroad, for example. It's difficult for countries outside of Europe to export agricultural produce to Europe. Now, the Americans have complained about Europe and agricultural prices for many years in the World Trade Organization. American agriculture is not protected. European agriculture is. So the Americans say the European farmers have an advantage over the American farmers. It's not fair competition. Well, those are two big players, the European Union and the Americans. Then if we think about very poor countries who are trying to export to Europe, then they're even going to have more problems. France protects particular items. France tries to protect the grape industry because obviously it produces a lot of wine. Japan imposes large tariffs on foreign rice. It wants to protect its own rice producers. So it's difficult for poor countries in that region to export to Japan. Import quotas may restrict total volume or value of goods imported. Sometimes countries put a quota on imports to say they will import so many items and no more. So once the quota is reached, no more imports are allowed. It's not a tariff, it's not a tax. A tariff would mean that many items can be imported, you just simply pay a higher tax. They pay the tax to the government, which will put the price up in that market. But a quota means only so many of the item are allowed into the country. After that, it's blocked. Sometimes countries can use documentation overload or red tape to try and stop imports. Poor countries, let's say, export to some countries, to other countries, and it may take a long time to clear the port because the goods all have to be opened and checked and health and safety issues considered and the documentation has to be rechecked and it takes a long time. So the benefits from exporting to that country are lost. It's lost in a bureaucratic maze. Sometimes countries use this bureaucratic process to try and block imports. Of course, in global trade, the rich countries have most power. They're the ones who can determine whether the items can be imported or not. They're the ones that have the bigger markets and most capital. Not necessary for countries with most people. So it's not necessarily the case that the countries with most people will have to engage in global democracy. They don't have to, because if they've got most people, they can be more or less self-contained. It's argued, for example, that China is such a big country that once it's developed, it really doesn't need the rest of the world to any great extent. It'll need to import certain raw materials to maintain its industrial base. But it's such a vast country that it will be broadly self-sufficient. And this means that China could become slightly more aloof again in the future. That's the view of certain commentators and the media. Whether that's the case or not, again, we only have to wait and see. But again, an area worth researching and worth thinking about. Transnationals. Well, the UN defines an association that possesses the means of control of production and services outside the country in which it was established. So if a company starts in one country and then moves to another country, or moves a branch to another country, and then controls the means of production and services outside of that country, this is known as a transnational. It bridges national territories. Normally they used the country of origin as a base. So if it starts in one country, it may spread out to other countries, but it still uses where it started as the base. So we think of oil companies in Holland, for example, the Dutch influence. We think of countries in terms of their origins. The Coca-Cola company is American. It may be produced in many countries under license, but it's we still think of it as American. Transnationals can move investment quickly if countries' economic circumstances change. Because they're there on the ground, they know the economic circumstances of the country, they're well informed about what's happening in the country, and they can then move resources very quickly if the situation deteriorates. So there are ways in which companies can move resources very fast. They have a presence in the countries and they're able to monitor what's happening in the country, what the political circumstances are, what issues the country is facing and what its policies are, and if need be it can move its resources out of the country quite easily and quite fast. There's a glossary of some of the terms we've encountered as a summary. I suggest you make a note right the way through. So we started with 145 slides. We're on 144 at the moment. You make a note of the slide number and you go back over this. This was not an orthodox class. It's not meant to be. It was just a fleeting discussion of some issues associated with globalization. Various points, various institutions, various ideas. It was just a collection of ideas. It's not meant to be a very coherent class with a central theme running the way through. Collection of ideas, collection of points. But that's all we're going to deal with here. I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.